Tonight, we're delighted to have with us Dr. David W. Blight. He is the director of Yale University's Lehman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. He also serves as professor of American history at Yale, and he is one of this nation's most honored historians. His books include Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory, and Beyond the Battlefield, Race, Memory, and the American Civil War. And he is the editor of The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, as written by himself, and The Souls of Black Folk, written by W.E.B. Du Bois. His books have won the Frederick Douglass Prize, the Lincoln Prize, the succession of honors from the Organization of American Historians, and the most prestigious of all, perhaps, the Bancroft Prize. His new book, for which we are honored to have him here tonight, is A Slave No More, Two Men Who Escaped to Freedom. It is a most significant historical document. There are few first-hand testimonies of slaves who ran away from their masters successfully, and in this book, Dr. Blight presents us with the remarkable narrative of two men, Wallace Turnage and John Washington, who did so, and whose gripping accounts have never before been published. What we have here then is quite extraordinary, and we are eager to hear how these narratives of emancipation came into public view and how they came to Dr. Blight's attention. Would you please join me this evening in welcoming Dr. David W. Blight.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's wonderful to be in Atlanta. It's wonderful to see, frankly, some of my best old friends. Not old best friends, best old friends from previous years. I've just met the parents of one of my graduate students, and I've just encountered Sue Ellis. Where are you? There you are, who was part of my Teachers Institute last summer at Yale. And when you're on a book tour far from home, believe me, it's great to meet some friends wherever you stop. It's also great to be part of this series. I mean, I can't tell you, it's an honor to appear between my good friend Ed Ball, who's actually almost my neighbor in New Haven, Connecticut, and before Dan Howe, who's also a good friend. Not to mention all the really famous writers on that list, apart from these historians. As Mr. Starr indicated, I had the extraordinary good luck to have two authentic, untouched, unedited, unpublished slave narratives written after the Civil War, in effect, all but fall into my lap about 4 years ago. I want to tell you that story in a minute, how that happened, and then tell you John Washington and Wallace Turnage's stories, and then indeed say a little bit about what I've done with them in this book and what they help us understand in a much broader way about the Civil War and particularly about emancipation. But what do we do with emancipation in our national historical memory? What is the freedom of slightly more than 4 million Americans in the midst of a horrible, violent, chaotic Civil War really mean? Where does the emancipation of the slaves fit? Where's its place in America's national story? Is this something we now collectively love to celebrate? Or is it something we can tend to see through a prism of tragedy and violence on a scale Americans had never imagined before then? Where does it fit? In a presidential inaugural address in 1989, President George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, for those of you who are young enough, the President Bush you probably don't even know, but there's a sentence in his inaugural in 1989 that I never forgot. Speechwriters for presidents, of course, try to write those lines you won't forget. And I don't know if this was one of Peggy Noonan's lines she wrote for that reason or not, but I didn't forget it because she had President Bush say, "We must remember we are the nation that sent 600,000 of its sons to die rather than have slavery. Now, that's sort of true, but nearly half of those died to preserve slavery. So, who wouldn't want to live in that country that went through such blood sacrifice for human freedom? That's one way we might try to remember emancipation. Or do we remember it as part of now the vast, popular, enthusiastic, and sometimes deeply mythological memory of the Underground Railroad? The Underground Railroad is now everywhere, maybe not as much in Georgia as in the great Midwest or in New York State or in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and other parts of New England. Ohio is ground zero for the Underground Railroad, and I just spoke there last week 3 times in Ohio. You can't even get a cab driver in Cincinnati without hearing a story on the Underground Railroad, whether you even ask for it or not. Everybody knows somebody who owns a house that was some part of the Underground Railroad. Everybody in America now freed the slaves, in case you didn't look. We were all conductors on the Underground Railroad. It's that great kind of ascendant story about slavery, and of course it's full of real stories. There were real fugitive slaves, and there were real people who helped fugitive slaves. There were some real networks that helped fugitive slaves to freedom. The numbers, of course, were tiny. We now work with these rough estimates of between 20 and 40, maybe 50,000 American slaves who actually fled to freedom, mostly out of the Upper South, some of them by maritime ocean routes, to a successful freedom in the northern states or Canada in the 30 years before the Civil War. That's a tiny fraction of the total. If you look at websites and you look at the extraordinary enthusiasm for this story of the Underground Railroad in children's literature and in schooling, you would wonder how slavery ever lasted very long, because they were all running away, it seems. Do we put emancipation in that narrative or in that story? Or is emancipation one of the 2 greatest results of our Civil War? The first being, of course, the preservation in some form of an American Union. Of course, that union was a new union. It was really the rebirth, as Lincoln famously put it in the Gettysburg Address, and others did as well. Frederick Douglass used rebirth metaphors in so many of his wartime speeches at the same time. That first great result is, of course, the saving of an American Union to be reinvented into something new, a second American Republic, really, rooted in a second founding out of all that blood. And that second founding, of course, is captured in the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments and the first Civil Rights Acts of American history during Reconstruction. Indeed, you live today. We all live today under the umbrella, really, of the 14th Amendment. The Equal Protection Clause and the Citizenship Clause in the 14th Amendment is in some ways what holds this place together. 2/3 of all litigation in law books is 14th Amendment litigation. But there would never have been a 14th Amendment. There would never have been an Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution at that time, probably even in the 19th century, had it not been for emancipation, which is the Civil War's second great result, and of course deeply intertwined with the first. It's the emancipation of America's 4 million slaves that brought about, in effect, a second American Republic out of the first that was destroyed at Antietam and Gettysburg and Atlanta and so many other places. Now, it was W.B. Du Bois, in his book Black Reconstruction, he wasn't the first to struggle with this story as a historian, but he struggled with it in some memorable passages and sections of that great book in the 1930s. In Black Reconstruction, Du Bois wrote this: If the Negro, he said, had been silent, his very presence would have announced his plight. He's referring to blacks now after the Civil War up into the early 20th century. He was not silent, however, said Du Bois. He was in unusual evidence. He was writing petitions, making speeches, parading with returned soldiers, reciting his adventures as slave and freeman. He was in unusual evidence. Du Bois is a little like Lincoln or the Bible, for that matter. He was always giving us book titles. And I actually wanted to call this book at one point Unusual Evidence, but my publisher probably quite intelligently said, nah, nobody's going to know what that means. And instead we went with a direct quotation from one of the slave narratives, and hence A Slave No More. But what happened to me was that I had two remarkable pieces of unusual evidence fall into my lap, a historian's dream. And here's how that happened. About 4 years ago, a literary agent in Boston, whose name is Wendy Strothman, brought John Washington's slave narrative to me in manuscript form, typescript, and said, would I have a look at it, check it out, authenticate it, see if it's real, etc. Well, and she believed it was real, and consider whether I would publish it. And she was working on behalf of the document's owner, a man named Julian Houston, who is a now retired African-American judge in Boston. He owns this narrative and its accompanying documents, some of which are extraordinary. He wanted a historian to work on this narrative. I, at the time, didn't pay a great deal of attention to it for the reason largely that I was moving from one job at Amherst College to Yale. And my life was all in boxes, and I took a few months to even bother to sit down and read it. And actually, Wendy used to call me on the phone and say things like, will you read it already? What are you doing? Independently of that, about 4 or 5 months after Wendy gave me that first narrative, I was invited right after I'd moved to Yale to give a talk at, of all places, the Greenwich, Connecticut Historical Society, a small historical society in, ironically, the richest per capita town in the United States. I don't know if you know Greenwich, Connecticut, but a lot of big mansions in Greenwich. And they now, in their little local historical society, have a slave narrative. And there's an irony in that. Anyway, I'm invited there to give a lecture to their annual board meeting, and I'm sitting at dinner, and the director says to me, my staff thinks we have an authentic slave narrative. Would you have a look at it? And I said something stupid to her like, another one? What's going on? Where are they growing these things? And she gave me a typescript copy. I took it home. I sat down with the two of them, indeed, and I realized what I had. And it was very easy to authenticate them, especially when I could see the originals. But I realized what I had were two remarkable, again, unmediated and untouched, raw, never published, narratives of emancipation. Both men telling largely the story of how they escaped in the midst of the Civil War. And to some extent, in John Washington's case to a great extent, in Turnage's case is somewhat less, they were also telling their story of their coming of age as boys and young men under slavery. Now, how do we get these documents? This, too, is easily part of the story. And there will be more of these appear. There may even be one in your attic. Because one of these is a kind of a box in the attic story. The first, John Washington's narrative, came to us because John Washington, and I'll tell you where he's from and how he escaped in a moment. He escaped in Virginia, Fredericksburg, Virginia, where he grew up. But he would live out most of the rest of his life in Washington, D.C., and he wouldn't die until 1918. And he was part of that first generation of freedmen who escaped into Washington and became part of that growing and eventually big and significant black community of Washington, D.C. He would marry his childhood sweetheart, a free black girl from Fredericksburg named Annie Gordon. They had 5 sons. The youngest of those sons, Benjamin, they're all interesting, but that youngest son in particular achieved a remarkable education. He went to M Street High School in Washington, a very good black high school in the segregated school system of Washington that was hard to get into. He attended Harvard summer school. He took science courses in the University of Chicago summer school, and he did his BA at Howard in Washington and went on to be a science teacher in D.C. for 45 years. His daughter, a woman named Evelyn Washington Easterly, ended up with her grandfather's narrative. She lived until the 1970s. And in 1976, she actually gave the narrative to the Library of Congress. And then she got cold feet and wanted it back in about 6 months later. And I have the correspondence she exchanges between the chief archivist of the Library of Congress and Evelyn. She writes and says, "I think I want that back." He says, "Okay, you can have it back, but maybe we make a photocopy." She says, "Yes." He makes the photocopy, sends it back to her. I have all this correspondence. So I always knew when I saw that correspondence that there would be a photocopy at the LC, and gosh, maybe I'll get scooped, you know. Turned out John Washington's narrative actually, before I got to work on it, it actually had appeared on the World Wide Web, put there by a literature professor at Virginia Commonwealth University who found it at the Library of Congress. And he put it on a syllabus. He was teaching it at Virginia Commonwealth. Happily, he didn't ever try to publish it. So I did. Evelyn Easterly died shortly after that, just 2 years after that, in 1978. And she left the document, again with a variety of other materials, to one of her best friends, a woman named Alice Jackson Stewart, who is the mother of Julian Houston, who now owns it. Alice Stewart worked on it. She collected other documents. She even did family trees. And I am the beneficiary of some of the work she did on it. But then she got elderly, was never able to publish it, and left it to her son. That's how we got it. In the other case, Wallace Turnage, it's in some ways more mysterious and yet more interesting. Turnage was born on a small tobacco farm near Snow Hill, North Carolina, Greene County, North Carolina, if you know that state. I'll tell you his story in a moment. After his escape from slavery in Mobile Bay in Alabama in August of 1864, he would live out the war as a servant in a Union regiment. And he would eventually live out most of the rest of his life in New York City and in Jersey City, New Jersey, right across the Hudson River. He would become part of a very struggling black working class in northern cities. More on that in a moment. He will marry 3 times. His first 2 wives died. He had 7 children, 4 of whom died in infancy. His youngest daughter, her name was Lydia Turnage Connolly, saved her father's narrative. Lydia married an Irish immigrant hotel worker in the 1940s, and they moved to Greenwich to work in a rich people's hotel. Both of them did. And Lydia outlived her husband and apparently passed for white, and described herself, to explain her dark complexion, as being Portuguese, with the name Connolly. But Lydia lived to be 99 and died in a nursing home in 1984 in Greenwich. And when she died, she had one friend apparently left in the world, a neighbor lady. Her name is Gladys Watts. She's still alive. And Gladys kept one box of Lydia's material. That box was about the size of the top of this lectern. And Mrs. Watts sat on that material for nearly 18 years until she watched a television documentary in late 2002, maybe early 2003, called Unchained Memories, which some of you may remember. It was a television documentary about the WPA oral history narratives done in the 1930s, an excellent film. And after watching that film, she called up the Greenwich Historical Society and said, I may have something that will interest you. And they sent someone out to see her, and they said, yes, you do. And she donated the box to this local historical society. And in that box, the only thing in it is a black clamshell box with a beautiful box, actually, as though it may have been made for this, although it's not. I'm not entirely sure of that. In the middle, there's a lid you open, and the narrative fits perfectly into it. It's written in a leather-bound stationery book that Wallace Turnage bought at a stationery shop in Lower Manhattan and still has the insignia of the stationery shop and its address right on it. He wrote it on blue-lined paper in a stationery book. The only other things in that box were 5 gorgeous photographs. 4 of Wallace Turnage in his Sunday finest suit that he had taken in studios at different ages, probably ranging from about the late 1870s up possibly to as old, possibly till 1900 or a bit after. He didn't die till 1916. And 1 beautiful photo of Lydia, the daughter, when she was probably only about 18, when she was still a girl. And one other large object, 1 book that Turnage had owned. It was a world history. That's all we had to go on Wallace Turnage. That's it. Now, I had the great good fortune to work with a research assistant in this, who I always make sure I mention. Her name is Christine McKay. She is a genius at genealogy, and she works primarily at the Schomburg Library in New York, part of the New York Public Library. The Schomburgs in Harlem. And Chris, I hired her to help me because she really knows how to do this kind of research, and she taught me. So in census manuscripts, in city directories, in pension records, in Freedmen's Bank records, it turns out both men took out Freedmen's Bank accounts. Wallace Turnage's first Freedmen's Bank account was like for $2.12, 1870. In all kinds of other documents, marriage certificates, death certificates, birth certificates, newspapers, and other sources, particularly newspapers, I was able to round out the lives of each man, at least to a certain extent, to know where they were, what they did, their occupations, who their children were, the churches they belonged to, some of their civic activities, their fraternal order activities, what they did in old age, and where they're buried. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, it's worth taking just 1 minute to help us understand how rare these documents actually are. From the 1740s to the Civil War, over more than a century, we have approximately 65 slave narratives, autobiographies by former slaves, written and published in English in Britain or the United States. That's it, before the Civil War. Now, in this group, of course, are the famous ones. Frederick Douglass's narrative, the greatest of all of them. Harriet Jacobs's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, a terrific, almost miraculous book, now quite widely taught. Josiah Henson, Solomon Northrup's, William Wells Brown, and many others. This is really, in many ways, the original African-American literature. After the Civil War, from 1865 until about the 1920s, when the last of American slaves began to die off who wrote about their lives, we have only about 55 such narratives. That is, autobiographies by former slaves telling their stories. Some of those are long columns or serialized columns in newspapers. Many of them are full published books. The most famous in the post-war genre is, of course, Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, published in 1901, and perhaps still the most widely read African-American autobiography ever written. Now, there are very real differences between the two parts of this genre. The pre-Civil War narratives are by and large all about the oppression of slavery. They are deeply shadowed by the experience of slavery. They are in every way anti-slavery propaganda documents. They often conform, the pre-war narratives, they often conform to certain formulas. Many of them, most of them, have a kind of imprimatur letter published at the beginning of them by a famous white abolitionist. Frederick Douglass's original narrative has letters of endorsement from William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips. Harriet Jacobs had the same sort of endorsement letter from Lydia Maria Child, and on we could go. But they are also, the best of them, frequently deeply revealing psychological portraits of the meaning of slavery and the meaning of its denial. And they are in many ways still the best access we have to that actual experience of slavery. The post-war genre took different forms. They were often written by clergymen. They are often, therefore, kind of spiritual conversion narratives. Many of them are written by former black Union soldiers who become clergymen. They tend to be success stories, prosperity stories. They have titles like From Slave Cabin to the Pulpit, or the one entitled From Slavery to Affluence, which is a bit overstated. The post-war genre tend to be, in other words, stories about how the narrator survives slavery, put it behind him, and then competes in the world and wins, which is what Booker T. Washington's narrative does. Now, what makes John Washington and Wallace Turnage's narrative so extraordinary is it's into this second part of the genre that they now fit. But because they were never published, and no editor ever touched them, nobody filtered them through an editorial or publishing process, at least not that I can tell. They arrive in a kind of a raw, beautiful form. They are largely the declarative and sometimes metaphoric stories of two former slaves telling us who they were, what slavery had meant to them, how they had achieved their freedom in the midst of the war, and what that meant to them. And each of them, frustratingly, ends his narrative pretty much right after his escape. In fact, Wallace Turnage at the end of his puts the words, "the end." And you want to grab him by the collar and say, no, what happened to you? Where did you go? Where are you? We had to find that out on our own. Well, here's their story. John Washington is born in 1838 in Fredericksburg, Virginia. His father was white, although he never tells us who he was, even if he did know. And believe me, we looked high and low. But there are so many Washingtons in the state of Virginia, especially around Fredericksburg, which is where George Washington's wife came from and most of his cousins. At one point, we actually had a lead on a John M. Washington, which is the middle initial that my John used throughout his life. And that John M. Washington was a first cousin of George Washington, the George Washington. And for a few days I thought, whoa, he's related to George. Won't this be cool? Didn't work out. Dry run. His mother was a slave woman named Sarah, later Sarah Tucker. And quite remarkably, in both cases, they tell us that their mothers first taught them their letters and their alphabet. They had literate mothers. Now, that's unusual. What we know about slave literacy rates in the late antebellum period, 5 to maybe 10%, higher in towns and cities than in the rural countryside or the deep cotton belt. He grows up in Fredericksburg, an urban slave, and that means a great deal, because he had certain privileges and certain chances given his urban environment. By the middle and late 1850s, he was hired out some 5 times. He was hired out to a tobacco factory for a year. And he loved working there, by the way, because he liked the work routines. He knew exactly what he had to do from that hour to that hour, and knew if he worked 2 or 3 more hours every day, he could make some extra money they would let him keep. He also, for the first time at that tobacco factory, heard black spirituals, because the workers would sing work songs and spirituals, and he loved it. He said, "I've never heard such singing like that." He was hired out to a family where he was a sort of domestic jack of all trades. He was hired out to a hotel. He was hired out at one point to a saloon, tavern down in Richmond, which he loved because he got to see an even bigger city for a while. He also fell in love with a young girl named Annie Gordon, who was about 5 years younger than him. He met her at church. He became a member of the African Baptist Church in Fredericksburg. He particularly liked it after the white part of the congregation left and built their own church, and it became exclusively a black church. His white mistress used to force him to go to the black version of the church service, and the reason, she would always demand that he remember the text of the minister's text, because that way she would know he had been there. But he tells several stories about how he learned how to be a good liar. And he would go to the door, he would memorize the text when the preacher mentioned or named it, and then he would run down to the Rappahannock River and go swimming and go out with his buddies and run in the woods and so on. But meeting young Annie Gordon was important. Among the documents that have survived in John Washington's papers, which are today housed at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, are a variety of other documents. Let me mention just 2. He wrote love letters to Annie, and one of them survives. It's written in 1858. It's about a 3-page letter. It could have been written last night. It's a love letter. I love you. I can't live without you. I want to marry you. I saw you with so-and-so. It's a love letter. And we don't have a lot of such love letters by slaves, former slaves, to each other. But at the same time, he also kept a diary. And what survives are simply fragments of that diary that he kept between, at least in the fragments, between 1857 and about 1860. They're fragments of a diary that is essentially about his courtship of Annie. She loves me not. I saw her the other day. She glows in my eyes. And again, that could have been written last night. It's about the oldest story in human history. The guy's in love. And he will marry Annie in January 1862 at the African Baptist in Fredericksburg, 3 months before he escaped from slavery. More on their story in a moment. Now, John Washington bided his time. He was not brutalized as a slave. He never mentions being whipped. His portrait of slavery is essentially psychological. And he tells us any number of episodes about how he would kind of be locked away by his mistress, prevented from having a real childhood. He describes one beautiful scene, beautiful in a literary sense, where his mistress would make him sit on a stool all day and be at her beck and call. He was about 10, 11, 12 years old in this period. She'd have him sit on that stool, just sit there so she could always see where he was and use him when she needed him. And he describes one day as a beautiful spring day. He can smell the scent of flowers coming through the window, wafting on him, and he sees his friends out there playing in the Rappahannock River. And he converts it into this discussion of how that's freedom, this is slavery. And there are a number of scenes like that, particularly where he'll use nature in some form as a metaphor for freedom. As I said, John bided his time, and he will escape at the first chance, the first moment that the Union armies arrived along the Rappahannock River in Fredericksburg in April of 1862. And in brief, here's what he did. The most dramatic 2 scenes really in his narrative, well, there are 2 or 3, but it's right before the Yankees are to arrive, and the white population of Fredericksburg is evacuating. And he describes the scene with him and Mrs. Tolliver, that's his owner. It was originally owned by a man named Thomas R. Ware, and Mrs. Tolliver was his widow. At any rate, she says to him, now John, you'll be with us tomorrow. You'll be with us tomorrow. And she's packing up stuff and preparing to leave. And he claims she was literally packing the silver spoons. Why not? And she says, now, John, you'll be with us. And he describes saying back to her, oh, yes, mistress, of course, I'll be with you tomorrow. She presumes his loyalty, and he says, sure. His next scene is the next day. He's working at a hotel called the Shakespeare. Kid you not, there was a hotel called the Shakespeare. And it, again, is a measure of how valued he was, how skilled, how bright. The white manager of the hotel apparently treated him, in effect, as kind of an assistant manager. And all the whites in the hotel, the guests, the management, are packing up and fleeing. And John describes how the manager or owner of the hotel gave him a wad of cash and said, here, pay off the help, most of whom are black slaves. They're hired out. And he describes the scene of how all the whites are fleeing, but all the blacks go up on the roof of the hotel, about 12 of them, where they can see, he says, the gleam of the Yankees' bayonets and hear the sound of their bands across the river. And then he brings them all down into the kitchen. He pays them their money, and he pours a round of drinks in the kitchen, and he holds a toast. And the toast was to the Yankees. And then he describes telling them all, get out of here, but don't get too far from the Yankees. And then John simply walked 2 blocks down the street to the Rappahannock River. He watched the bridges being burned, and then he witnessed the surrender of the city of Fredericksburg. And then he describes simply walking about a mile upriver, north and west, in the direction, he says, of the sound of the Yankee bands. And then he said, I crossed down to the river at Ficklin's Mill, and the ruins of Ficklin's Mill are still there. So I know exactly where he crossed the river. He goes down to the river, and he describes how Union soldiers on the other side yell over to him, do you want to come over? He says, yes. They send over a boat. He gets in the boat. They row him over. And he spent that night in the camp of the 21st New York Regiment that kept a regimental history that was actually quite useful to me in reconstructing John's story. He was freed, literally and technically freed, by an officer in that regiment whose name was William Ladd. John actually names him. And the authority to free him, you got to remember, this is before the Emancipation Proclamation. It's even before the Second Confiscation Act was passed by Congress. What authority did those Union troops have to technically free him? Well, this officer decided he would free him based on the law Congress had just passed 2 days earlier, on April 16, this was April 18, that was the liberation of slaves in the District of Columbia. And he says, John says, he said to him something like, well, they announced the slaves are free in Washington, D.C., so I guess we can free you, so you're free. And John Washington spent the rest of that summer, throughout the summer months, right on through August, as, in effect, a servant in the Union Army in Northern Virginia, and he became, by his account, the chief mess cook in General Rufus King's staff in the Union Army. He was with the Union Army right on up through the disastrous campaign of Second Manassas, which occurred on the last 2 days of August. And he enters Washington, D.C., by his account, on September 1st, 1862. Slept in the streets of Washington for the first days, but somehow, and I don't know exactly how, by the middle of that fall, he had his wife Annie, their newborn baby, his mother Sarah, and his grandmother Molly, who was 68 years old, and herself the mother of 8 children, in Washington, D.C. with him. They appear in a city directory in 1863. His first known address in Washington was on 17th Street, and it's the exact address of what is today Constitution Hall, which is about 2 blocks down from the White House. And in late 1863, along with about 400 other former slaves, freedmen from Fredericksburg, he helped found the Shiloh Baptist Church in Washington, 4 blocks north of the White House, in what he described as a shanty. That became a famous church in Washington. one of two churches John Washington would belong to and be very active in the rest of his life. Now, Wallace Turnage's story is more difficult, more brutal, and more violent. Turnage, as I said, was born on a small tobacco farm in Greene County, North Carolina. He was sold at age 14 in early 1860, eve of the Civil War, eve of secession and the Civil War. He was sold by his indebted owner to a Richmond, Virginia slave trader whose name was Hector Davis. And we know a lot about Hector Davis. He was one of the top two wealthiest slave traders in Richmond. He owned a 2-story slave auction house and jail, and he kept an enormous array of account books, one of which survives to this day in the Chicago Historical Society. It landed there apparently because it was confiscated at the end of the Civil War when Richmond fell by an Illinois regiment that took it back to Chicago. And I calculated in that account book that Hector Davis, in 1 week in 1859, by my account, the best week he ever had, he sold approximately $120,000 worth of slaves in 1 week. Now, he didn't always sell that many, but that's how much money people made in the domestic slave trade. And if you've ever wondered at all why this war came about, add one other little statistic to that. In 1860, that very year when Wallace Turnage is sold to Hector Davis in Richmond, American slaves, we now estimate, were worth, as a financial asset, approximately $4 billion, and they were the largest financial asset in the entire American economy, worth more as an asset than all manufacturing and all railroads put together. The only thing more valuable in the American economy in 1860 was the land itself, and we really don't know how to put a number on that. Wallace was first sold for $950 by his owner. Now, in Wallace's case, his father was also white, and he knew exactly who he was. His name was Sylvester Brown Turnage. His father was the stepson of his mistress, that is, the woman who owned him. And all the rest of his life, on every document in his life, whether it's a bank record or a certificate of marriage or whatever, he put his father's name on it, Sylvester Brown Turnage. It's not at all clear he ever knew him, because his father moved out of that county. I have a record of this. His father moved out of that county when Wallace was only about 3 or 4 years old. It's not clear he would have even known him. Wallace spent about 6 months in Hector Davis's slave auction house. His job while he was there was helping organize the slave auctions, preparing the slaves for the auction. He's 14 years old. One day he's told, "You're in the auction." And he was sold to an Alabama cotton planter named Chalmers, who came to Richmond twice a year to buy slaves. 3 days later, by train, he found himself on a large cotton plantation of about 80 slaves near Pickensville, Alabama, which is in central west Alabama, right over on the Mississippi border. And most of the rest of Wallace Turnage's narrative, most of the document really, is the story of his 5 attempts to run away, to escape, most of it during the Civil War after it broke out, until he finally succeeded on the 5th try. I won't go into the details of all of these attempts to run, but he was, as he put it in the narrative, a frequent runaway. And all of his escapes are induced by either a whipping, brutal beatings, or the threat of a beating, or by witnessing beatings. He ran 4 times into Mississippi, beginning in late 1860 and then again in late 61, in 62, twice in 62. He would always go over into Mississippi, and he's quite detailed about place names, distances, and so on, which was one of the ways I was able to gain a little trust in his memory. He names at least 15 towns in Mississippi, and he is uncannily accurate about the names of these towns and even the distances. I got out my Rand McNally Road Atlas at first and just started testing them out here. You know, is Rienzi after Altoona or before Altoona? And he had it right. On that fourth attempt to escape in late 1862 and into early 63, he was at large about 4.5 months by his accounting. He hid in other slave cabins. He hid in gullies and woods and fence corners. He describes being chased by dogs and all kinds of things. Every time he's captured. On that fourth attempt, though, he almost made it. He was trying to get to Corinth, Mississippi. Corinth is right up in the northeast corner of Mississippi, almost on the Tennessee border. He was trying to get there because it was a garrisoned, Union-controlled town. And by late 62, early late 62, it had the largest contraband camp anywhere in the South. There were an estimated 6,000 freedmen living in this tent city, most of them from Alabama. He was trying to get to the Union Army and to that contraband camp. He's captured again. He was housed for nearly another month in effect, this bounty hunter patrolman's cabin, until his master came to get him. And each time he ran, his owner, Mr. Chalmers, would come after him because he was so valuable. He's 15, he's 16 years old, he's finally 17 when Chalmers got fed up. And after that fourth escape, and by the way, Wallace includes any number of brutalities he describes. He describes being in neck braces and wrist chains and ankle chains and all kinds of things. But his master takes him back down to Alabama on this fourth occasion of his runaway. And there's one final scene before Chalmers sells him. He describes how he and his master are almost back to Pickensville, and they run into a Confederate patrol, and these Confederate troops decided to have some fun and some sport. So they took Wallace and they tied him to a tree, and they were going to use him for target practice. And his master begged them not to shoot him because he was so valuable. And they let him go. 3 days later or so, Chalmers took him down to Mobile and sold him for $2,000. That was Confederate money by then, so we can't be sure what that was worth. But he sold him at the slave jail auction house in Mobile in spring 1863. And he was sold to a merchant, a wealthy merchant in Mobile. His name was Minge. And he worked for the next year, a little more than a year, as a kind of domestic jack-of-all-trades for this family. He got involved in the local Black Baptist church. He complained that he wasn't allowed to be baptized because the Confederate troops weren't allowing outdoor baptisms because it was deemed too dangerous, so he was angry he never got to have a real baptism. But he was actually about to have a different kind of baptism. And one day he was driving his master's carriage, which was one of his jobs, and he crashed the carriage. The harness broke, the pony got away, the carriage crashes. Confederate troops pick him up and tell him to walk home. He walks home. His mistress was angry as hell. She pushed him into the basement of the house. She forced him to lay bricks in a mud floor as a kind of punishment. And he kind of seems to have cracked again. And he ran, he says, down into the city of Mobile, into the black and Creole neighborhoods of Mobile, which by then he probably would have known relatively well. And he hid out for about another week. And then he's captured again. And this time he's taken to the slave jail in Mobile. His master was brought in, and his owner ordered 30 lashes with some god-awful contraption that Wallace describes. And interestingly enough, the Mobile newspapers would run notices about slave whippings. They would list the owner's name, sometimes the name of the slave, how many lashes were administered at this slave jail, and the price paid for them, as though it was just like another public financial transaction. Wallace was strung up by his wrist, naked, and given this beating. At the end of it, his master said, "Walk home." But instead of walking home, he simply walked out of Mobile. But he went right straight through the Confederate fortifications and encampment. At that point, Mobile was garrisoned. This was early August 1864. It was garrisoned with about 10,000 Confederate troops, huge fortifications all around the southwest part of the town. And no doubt Wallace was simply mistaken for yet another black campaign, of which there would have been hundreds. In fact, slaves had built those fortifications. And at dusk, he simply walked right through. And he then found himself in the snake-infested and alligator-infested swamps all along the western shore of Mobile Bay. The rest of his narrative is the story of his 3-week trek down through this swamp, much of which is called the Foul River Estuary, which breeds a major percentage of the birds I'm told, of that whole part of the Gulf region. It's a gorgeous swamp. I did a whole full-day ferry boat ride in that swamp. It's a beautiful swamp. You don't want to go in it. I saw the alligators and so on. It took him 3 weeks to traverse this terrain. He nearly starves. He lives on fruit he finds. He gets sick. He finally ends up out at the tip of Mobile Bay near a little point called Cedar Point. And he describes his last 3 or 4 days there living on a kind of platform he builds on the swamp where he can lay by day. But by night he hides up in a lookout platform that the Confederate troops had built. They come out by day, he comes down, they go down, he goes up, day and night. He slept at night up there to get away, he said, from the mosquitoes. And Alabamans tell me that's a wise thing to do. Finally, one day, and his narrative is full of a deep religiosity, he says he prayed really hard one night. And the next day, the tide brought in an old rowboat. And he said he grabbed a, quote, plank of wood, and he simply started rowing out into Mobile Bay. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen Mobile Bay, but this is God's great ocean. You don't go in that bay in a rowboat if you're in your right mind, but he did. And then he gets he's trying to capture, obviously, the most dramatic moment in his story, and you can feel it on the page as he tries to do it. He gets quite dramatic. There's a wave about to swamp his boat, and he says he began to hear oars, and the oars he heard were the sailors in a Union gunboat. And they yelled to him, "Jump in." He jumps in, and then there's a little scene he describes. He says, after I jumped in, I sat down, and he said, the 8 Yankee sailors, as they looked at me, were struck with silence. And I don't doubt they were. They probably wondered, my God, who are you? How did you get here? He was half starved and naked, and who knows in what condition. And he has one little moment where he says, I turned around and looked at the shore and breathed my first breaths of freedom. They took him to a Sand Island fort. They clothed him, fed him, wrapped him in blankets, put him in a tent overnight. Probably the first time in his life any white people had ever done anything for him. And the next day they rowed him over to Dauphin Island, which is a big sandbar island out at the mouth of Mobile Bay that has, still to this day, this beautiful old fort called Fort Gaines. The gorgeous ruins of which are still there. And somewhere in that courtyard, he was interviewed by General Gordon Granger, who was the overall commander of all the Union forces in the Mobile region. And Granger probably interviewed him because he was an escaped slave from Mobile, and they wanted intelligence about Mobile. They were hopefully soon to try to take Mobile. And Granger gave him 2 choices. He could join a black regiment, which Granger and his officers were at that very time. They actually were trying to create 2 black regiments in the entire Gulf region. Or his second choice was to become a servant to a white officer. And Turnage chose the latter. He doesn't exactly tell us why, but we can guess. He'd seen enough suffering. Who knows? He served out the war as the mess cook and personal servant of a white officer named Junius Turner, a captain in a Union regiment from Maryland. And I know quite a bit about Mr. Turner because he lived to be 100 and he has a huge pension file. He was always bitching and writing in for more money until about 1930 when he died. Wallace's narrative ends. He's with the Union Army when they captured Mobile, although he doesn't tell that part in any detail. It's as though he just wanted to get his narrative over with. And then he's with Turner's regiment when they went to New Orleans at the very end of the war, guarding Confederate prisoners. And then I was able to learn that that regiment went up the Mississippi and across the country, which is no doubt where Wallace went, and they were mustered out in the summer of 1865 in Baltimore. Wallace Turnage lived 3 years in Baltimore. During that 3 years, he no doubt, in fact, he had to. He went back to North Carolina. I don't know exactly when, but he went back to North Carolina to get his mother, Courtney, some of his siblings, I don't think all of them, and he then moved to New York City. And Wallace, his mother, Courtney, and 4 of his siblings appear in the census in New York in 1870. He lived for 11 years in what today we call Greenwich Village, or part of it. It was then known as Little Africa. It was a community by the 1870s of between 2,000 and 2,500 African Americans, most of whom were former slaves from the Upper South. He lived at 313 Thompson Street and number 13 Minetta Lane. Minetta Lane became a famous, infamous street in the writings of Jacob Riis in his famous book, How the Other Half Lives. And Stephen Crane wrote about Minetta Lane, because Minetta Lane by the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s became a street of decadence. Saloons, they were called black and tan saloons, integrated saloons, prostitution, crime. Wallace struggled. He lived on that street for 4 years. His first children were born there. But he moved after 11 years in Manhattan across the river to Jersey City, and he lived out the rest of his life near the Elizabeth Park in Jersey City, dying in 1916. He worked at every conceivable kind of common laborer job. I found him in city directories and census material listed as everything from night watchman to drayman to bartender. At one point he's called a globe man, which turns out it meant he was a glass blower that made the little lamp bulbs for the street lamps, and other kinds of occupations. And at one point, toward the end of his life, he is listed as a, quote, general jobber. And I didn't even know what that meant at first. And I was on a fellowship last year at the New York Public Library, and I asked around among some of the smart people there, and the consensus was that a general jobber in an American city at the turn of the century was the guy on the street with a cart who buys things in the street from one group of people and tries to sell them to another group of people at a profit. It's a measure of what a struggling life Wallace had. But as I said earlier, he still went to those studios and had 4 beautiful photos taken of himself in his Sunday finest. He joined the Hamilton Lodge of the Odd Fellows, a black fraternal order, and he is buried today, as are all 3 of his wives and some of his children, in the collective burial plot of that fraternal order in Cypress Hill Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. Now, to conclude, what did I make of all this? Well, one, of course, I simply published their narratives with almost no editing, although I annotated them. When I come to a name, a place, a circumstance, I try to help the reader. In Wallace Turnage's case, I did paragraph it because he never met a paragraph. His narrative is about 120 pages. It's 1 paragraph. So I helped out the reader a little bit and broke that up. There's creative spelling and unusual grammar I left alone. It's part of the beauty, in some ways, of the documents. But more important even than just reading the narratives, to me as a historian, these allowed me 2 windows into this much larger story of emancipation in the Civil War. And though they are complementary in some ways, they're also quite different stories. One is an urban slave who escapes in the upper South in 1862, even before the Emancipation Proclamation, into the Union Army. And the other, a slave off a cotton plantation, a field hand in the Deep South, who escapes into Mobile Bay in the same month that Admiral David Farragut's fleet took Mobile Bay in the largest naval battle of the Civil War, where about 160-odd Union sailors died in one day, in part dying so this guy Wallace Turnage could escape down through that swamp. But it also allowed me to engage this debate we've had to some extent among historians in recent, the last 2 decades, I guess. It's really kind of a false debate. The debate over who freed the slaves. Were the slaves freed by Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Army, or did the slaves free themselves? Presidential emancipation versus self-emancipation. And in many ways, that's been a false debate, because these two narratives show us, I think, clearly the answer is both. Without the Union Army or the Union Navy, where they were at a given time, neither man gets free. But most importantly, without their own ingenuity, cunning, and bravery, neither man would have ever made it to freedom. Let me end with just 2 little points. One is that I want to end with their own voices, just a paragraph from each of them toward the end of their narratives. And the other, that throughout this project, we always knew that there's not likely to be any descendants of Wallace Turnage, because his 3 children died childless. And we gave up even trying to find any, although I have had no less than 5 emails from people named Turnage in various parts of the country, either thinking they are a descendant or wanting me to tell them and figure it out whether they're a descendant, the latest of which was just last week. A man had attended a black genealogy conference and heard about this book. His name is Turnage, and he says he's a direct descendant. We don't think so, but maybe he is. He survived slavery, put it behind him, and then competes in the world and wins, which is what Booker T. Washington's narrative does. Now, what makes John Washington and Wallace Turnage's narrative so extraordinary is it's into this